You know, I bet you might have heard of climate justice somewhere if you're paying attention. I think James Lindsay has talked about it, but I bet you've never heard of critical climate justice, and I hadn't until I read this article either. Oh, dear God, it's time for Thursday Study Review. Let's do this. So, climate justice is a very social justice-y driven thing, and a lot of you already know, if you've watched this channel for a long time, that I am a climate scientist for a living. I do not get into the social justice kind of things. I focus more so on the physical science and the modeling aspect of it, as much as others get into some of the social justice, particularly the activists that we have in climate science, which makes this all the more aggravating for me when I'm dealing with this, to see these things. But this one crossed my radar, and this was published in I think it was officially published in December of 2021, if I remember correctly, in the Geographical Journal, which is a journal of the Royal Geographical Society in England. But if you're going to wonder why, this is a commentary more so than a research article, but I think it bears a point to bear in mind, because you can publish commentaries in peer-reviewed journals. That is not an unknown thing to be able to publish it. I do think this article is a prime example of how not to communicate. But then again, it's also a prime example of postmodernist style, in that they do tend to just spit a lot of words at you, not define anything, and confuse the hell out of people at the same time. I have done my best to understand this, although I do think this is probably one that is much more in James Lindsay's wheelhouse than mine, to break down some of the language here. So if you end up watching this, I'll put the article in the description, as I always do, but feel free to have fun with this. As always, for everybody who's of course coming into this, by the way, we will have our live chat after the premiere of the Thursday Study Review for local supporters exclusively. So come on over to shiasophia.locals.com if you would like to join us on that particular aspect of fun. So, abstract first, as always. Climate change has had unequal and uneven burdens across places whereby the planetary crisis involves a common but differentiated responsibility. The injustices of intensifying climate breakdown have laid bare the fault lines of suffering across sites and scales. A climate justice framework helps us to think about and address these inequities. Climate justice fundamentally is about paying attention to how climate change impacts people differentially, unevenly, and disproportionately, as well as redressing the resultant injustices in fair and equitable ways. Critical climate justice, as a praxis of solidarity and collective action, benefits from greater engagement with intersectional and international feminist scholarship. Incorporating insights from feminist climate justice, which is another one I had not heard of until tonight, until I was reading this, bolsters solidarity praxis while enriching and reframing dominant climate change discussions for more impactful and accountable action. So, there you go. You can bet that this is going to be very postmodernist in its construction right from the jump. Here, right from the jump. Here we go. You'll get a good sense of what I think. I didn't even notice this when I first read it. The information, practices, and views in this article and the authors do not necessarily represent the Royal Geographical Society with IBG. Okay. Institute of British Geographers. That's good to know, isn't it? That's good to know. Well, I'm glad you put that in there, your Royal Geographic Society, that you don't think this represents you necessarily. Oh, 2022, so this is like January 2022 or something. Anyway. Let's see. In general terms, climate justice scholarships demonstrates how climate change is a moral and justice issue, not just a science, techno-managerial, or finance issue. In other words, climate justice fundamentally is about paying attention to how climate change impacts people differently, unevenly, and disproportionately, as well as redressing the resultant injustices in fair and equitable ways. The goals are to reduce marginalization, exploitation, oppression, and enhance equity and justice. Applying a climate justice approach is an intentional process that involves carefully analyzing who is excluded or marginalized by climate change processes, as well as any adaptation or mitigation interventions pursued. I didn't want it to jump like that. Hold on. Kind of didn't want it to. You're not going to cooperate with me tonight. Darn it. Okay. There's that. But, so you get it immediately right here with this, is that this is not about science. They're not answering a question at all. They're supposedly forming a praxis or a practice around how you frame questions and what have you that has to do with social justice. And you can be sure here, and this is one thing that is consistent with these kinds of things, never is justice defined here, though it can be assumed given some of the content that this is a postmodernist construction, and so they are thinking very much in the lines of their version of justice, which has to do with equality of outcomes, not with equal treatment, necessarily, which is usually what it is. Here, just judging from what I know about postmodernism, and again, this is another example where this gobbledygook James would have a field day and be able to interpret it much more easily than I would in some of these. So, but I'm going to do my best and invite him to do a bit on this one too, because I'm sure this is going to be of interest with respect to some of the things going on. But this is not to say, so, because in the physical science side, yes, there is the concern, what is sea level rise going to do? What is an increase in flooding rains going to do? What is it going to do in these different areas? And then it's a question of, okay, who lives in those areas? Can they adapt to it? And all those kinds of aspects. So there's not thought about that from the folks in my side of the spectrum, where we actually focus on the physical science that's involved. We do think about that, in part because if we're interacting with decision makers who have to make adaptation decisions or mitigation decisions, there is definitely that consideration that is given there, but it is not looked at necessarily as a social justice thing as much as, oh, we know this thing is going to happen to this people, so let's make sure people who can least manage it are safe, and in terms of a class issue, not necessarily even oppression or marginalization or whatever the heck would be the postmodernist issue. Anyway, a climate justice approach that focuses on who benefits, who loses out, in what ways, where, and why. It is an explanatory tool that helps better explain the relationships at different scales that co-create and maintain injustices. I was going to be talking about these intersectional things, and there's a whole bunch of intersectional stuff that I didn't even think, some days you can't even think, when are these folks going to run, when is the postmodernist going to run out of things they can convolute and link together at times, which is really difficult to deal with. Climate change has had unequal and uneven burdens across places, whereby the planetary crisis involves a common but differentiated responsibility. Hang on. Oh my, I thought I read that sentence once before. That is straight in the abstract. Damn, you couldn't even think to make your abstract a little bit more unique than just rip the sentence straight out of your paper and put it in the abstract. That's incredible. Good grief, man. The sentiment was captured in the 1992 United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. It is well documented how communities that have contributed the least to climate change are the ones who are most unduly burdened and harmed by it over decades and even centuries. Okay, now here's the fun part for you. This is where you know this is going. Historical and geographical differences are highlighted and brought to the forefront in discussing climate justice. Colonialism, capitalism, and globalization are imbricated in the production of uneven climate injustices, and critiques of these interlocking systems are increasingly included in climate justice scholarship. In what follows, I posit that critical climate justice is a praxis of solidarity and collective action that benefits from greater engagement with feminist scholarship. Attention to and engagement with intersectional and transnational feminist insights helps critically advance more nuanced and responsive understandings of climate justice. It can help reframe debates away from reductionist solutions to more accountable assessments and action. Remember, when you're talking about anything that is postmodernist, there's always an activist component. So this is, again, primarily about activism when they're talking about it here. And guess what? Right here, Colonialism, I'm surprised that globalization's been included in here, but anyway, colonialism, capitalism, and globalization are imbricated in the production of uneven climate injustices, and critiques of the interlocking systems are increasingly included in climate justice scholarship. And yeah, if you've got an activism bent here, it's not really scientific. What are we violating if we have an activism bent and we're pushing for specific policies and what have you in here? Oh, yes, we're violating the norm of disinterestedness. That's why it's not science when those things happen there. You're violating that one normative principle if you're getting into something in research. Now, admittedly, this is more of a commentary, so it's not necessarily a bad thing here to be expressing an opinion. It's very much in there that yes, you can express an opinion in a commentary piece in a journal. That is not unheard of to do. Because this is not necessarily about research. He's proposing this kind of thing, amorphous thing. That said, he's proposing it in line with scholarship. And scholarship is about the pursuit of the truth and not about activism. And this is where he's changing things. Wants something that to be more of an activist approach. This particular author wants a more activist approach to this kind of thing. And that's where I have a problem with this. So, critical climate justice praxis. To have justice, it becomes imperative to identify injustices that exist and address the underlying causes. Okay, hold it. Right there. Never define what justice is. So to have justice, you have to first define what the hell it is. not to identify injustices that exist. I mean, come on. I think I know what you were saying with justice here, what justice is, because justice in the minds here is that you don't have equal outcomes in different things, and therefore we have to push for this sort of equitable kind of nonsense. Climate justice is in many ways inherently about praxis. Praxis means theoretically informed practice with reflection, one where there are continual feedbacks and integrations. Philosopher Paulo Freire, I probably butchered the pronunciation, described praxis as, quote, reflection and action upon the world in order to transform it. Notice it right here. This is not about figuring out the world. This is about changing the world. Again, this is all about changing the world. And this is not about pursuing the truth in the slightest. Changing the world from what it is into what we want to see instead of actually understanding it. That is the tricky little thing here that you'll notice in postmodernist kind of philosophy. In broad terms, critical climate justice practice, God, what a phrase, demands systemic changes to address structural inequities and destabilize power systems that produce various climate injustices. So, right here. Remember, with these kinds of things, with postmodernist thought and critical theory, it is always about power. It is never about the truth. Again, continuing. Equity considerations emphasize actions that reduce and remove harms, making the underlying commitment of climate justice to political action and solidarity. There you go. It's not about figuring out climate change. It's not figuring out who's going to be hurt the most. It's all about what political action needs to be taken in solidarity. So when you're talking about critical climate justice and equity considerations emphasize actions that reduce and remove harms, again, hoping for equality of outcome. Admittedly, when you're talking about climate and you're talking about natural disasters, you don't want anybody to get hurt, and you do try to protect the most vulnerable that you can as an emergency manager. That is part of your job. But, with respect to a natural disaster that's ongoing, and to the degree that is also the responsibility of different government officials. But, trying to presume that you're going to have an exactly equal outcome here is a completely different thing, which is very unlikely, because as much as you may want people to do something, we find this with emergency management all the time, just because you want somebody to do something does not mean they are going to do it. There is that kind of problem. And as much as we may want equal outcomes, at times, you're not necessarily ever going to get it, because people are indeed people at times. Critical climate justice underscores issues of differential exposure, vulnerability, and risk. Accountability and obligations, as well as ethics and human rights, are integral to climate justice. You notice everything gets shoved in. I noticed this when I was reading it. Every single damn little thing gets shoved in here. This also involves a reevaluation of global political economic systems that produce and reinforce socio-spatial injustices. Now, this is a new one on me. Socio-spatial injustices, which has to do with social injustice and what have you. And I would take a wager that this would connect with another thing that has critical in its name. Critical physical geography has a very power-driven thing, which also talks about some of these socio-spatial injustices nonsense too, which is basically to say, oh, yeah, injustices have been different with people in space because of where people are and who gets impacted and where they end up being. And all those kinds of things. So it's an absolute mess that way. I'm guessing that's what that is. I haven't given the time to actually dive exactly into what that is yet. Again, James Lindsay, help. Might be a little bit here because I am a little out of my depth with this one. But that would be my assessment here of socio-spatial injustices here has to do with, I think, the idea that for whatever reason, the global economic system and the injustices of the system and inequities and all this kind of stuff, well, the system pushed different people who were marginalized into living in certain areas where they would be more vulnerable, and hence the spatial part of the injustice. You ended up living in a different spot in space because the system pushed you to live there, supposedly. The goal is not to further... That would be my guess. Anyway, I'm not 100% sure. Again, this guy gives no damn definitions for anything. Gives absolutely no definitions for anything. The goal is not to further burden impacted communities with further harms, loss, and damages. A critical climate justice perspective investigates how and why different groups of people face inequities in different ways from climate change, integrating insights from a range of academic theories such as feminist, anti-racist, anti-capitalist, post-colonial, decolonial scholarship. That's a mouthful, but anti-racist right here is your Kendys and your D'Angelos, actually, who we all know engage in lots of Kafka traps, and also tend to like promoting discrimination for the sake of getting rid of discrimination, which usually doesn't end well, at least in history, as well as insights from activist movements for climate justice in order to foster praxis of solidarity and collective action. Never about the individual, it's always about the collective and the power, different power dynamics and what have you. Indeed, climate justice is not only an academic body of interdisciplinary scholarship, but involves social justice and environmental movements. Activist movements and non-governmental organizations pushed for the climate justice debates of the 2002 Conference of Parties. Thus, climate justice has always involved grassroots initiatives and activist alliances resulting in collaborations across place-based mobilizations. Climate justice has become a galvanizing force among social movements, indigenous movements, and youth movements. While some variation exists in the consideration and practice of climate justice, the overarching commonality of understanding and mobilization focuses on equity and fairness in climate governance and redressing climate-related harms. Critical climate justice practice encourages academic theorizations that are empirically derived and contextually appropriate. Now, what they mean here with this is empirically derived, yes, that is still technically about data. My assessment of what they mean with contextually appropriate, based on some of the other stuff in the article, is that it centers the wisdom and lived experiences of people and goes in that direction. That's what I think they mean by that. And particularly with the next sentence, which kind of calls to that a little bit. It is continuous unlearning to relearn and collaborate, reevaluate, and redress various interlocking oppressions. You know why I went crazy last night? Crazy reading this. Climate justice approaches seek to expose the root causes of climate change to address and dismantle systemic issues and structures in different ways. These include dismantling fossil fuel dependency, defetishizing endless capitalist growth on a finite planet, challenging non-participatory democracy. Wouldn't a non-participatory democracy just be fascism or something? Anyway, resisting extractive exploitation of natural resources, confronting racial capitalism and indigenous erasure, among other things. So all of your social justice cadres end up in this sentence here. So that's kind of why you should bear that in mind. Fossil fuel dependency. Yeah, no, don't get me wrong. I actually want to see fossil fuel dependency reduced over time. However, two things. Been shown very, very carefully in history many times that you cannot leapfrog over the evolution of energy in a society. You cannot force developing nations to leapfrog over using fossil fuels. It doesn't seem to work ever from every bit of evidence that I've been able to find. So that's one thing. And the other thing is, if you just suddenly ended fossil fuels tomorrow, what are you going to do with all the people whose jobs depend upon that, whose livelihoods depend upon that? Are you really going to throw them out? Because that's a great way to create a huge amount of vulnerable people who are marginalized and, would subsequently have a terrible problem if a natural disaster happened because they wouldn't have the means to escape or anything along that line. So, not thinking, going a little bit on here, I don't think, about what this would actually mean. Meaningful climate justice addresses complex issues across space, place, and scale. Spatial, across communities and countries. Temporal, historical, and intergenerational. Considerations in terms of vulnerabilities, losses, and damages have increasingly become apparent. Understanding and accounting for differentiated vulnerabilities and precarities are essential. Central to that. Consideration is brought to the role of power structures, and social disparities, and how these are embedded within multi-scalar issues such as broader political economy, development, and globalization. So right there, again, it is never about the truth with these things. It is all about who's got the power here. And that is an unhelpful kind of situation when it is all about the power with these particular things. So that's just something to note there, as it always is about the power again. Climate injustices are historically and spatially produced. These have disproportionately burdened racialized post-colonial communities in countries of the global south, as well as minoritized communities in the global north. Disaster frequencies and impacts have increased in large parts of the global south over several decades, such as hurricanes, cyclones, floods, sea level rise, heat waves, wildfires, air quality, and land erosion. But these are all now frequently impacting greater areas of the global north as climate breakdown ramps up globally. So, you notice there's no citation for any of that. There's no citation for any of that. Right here. And for very good reason. Sea level rise is not a disaster. It's a thing. It's not a natural disaster. It can cause more coastal flooding, but it's not a natural disaster. That's what I'm going to say. These guys don't know what they're talking about with respect to the actual underlying science if you make an error that fundamentally wrong here when you're looking at it. So just a note to self on that one. Let's see. The numbers of deaths, losses, and displacements and recovery costs have compounded across frontline communities. Holy crap, man! Climate apartheid draws attention to socio-spatial disparities of climate change, often correlating with colonial and racial injustices across places. I don't know quite what the hell they mean by climate apartheid, actually, but to even use that word here is pretty damn sick, to be honest. I don't even know what to say with that one. That's just disgusting that would even get mentioned like this. One of the reasons I don't like things like climate justice and social justice and environmental justice is that the minute you stick something in front of the word justice, it loses all its meaning. And this is a case here. I literally don't quite know, because apartheid was horrific in South Africa. Horrific evil in South Africa. I don't know what the hell you mean by climate apartheid in this. And I say this as somebody who studies climate change for a living. I really don't know. Goodness. I'm going to have to do some more digging on this article just to figure out what some of this stuff is myself. So if any of you know in the comments, tell me, because I'm just like, what the hell is that? I think there's some pretty strange stuff in this article. Some scholars have argued that wealthier countries owe post-colonial countries a climate debt due to historical and contemporary unequal ecological exchange and the colonization of the atmosphere by colonial and imperial states. Climate change has been a form of slow violence to racialized and impoverished communities across the global south. Racial capitalism and colonialism, along with contemporary neoliberal globalization, compound climate injustices. Past injustices make people more disproportionately vulnerable to climate impacts, which exacerbates impoverishment and vulnerabilities. The lived experiences of climate injustices. What the hell is that even? Give me an example of what a lived experience of climate injustice is. Because I really don't know. I honestly don't know what the hell that is. But this guy doesn't define anything, which is part of the problem. You will never see postmodernists define anything. Lots of fancy words, but no definitions for any of it. Therefore, scalar and contextual climate justice has become essential to assess and address. However, the normative aspect of climate justice has made international negotiations difficult, along with the global north not taking sufficient responsibility for historical and contemporary global emissions and enacting accountability. Given existing challenges at international level, scaled-up solidarity, praxis, and collective activism for critical climate justice is essential. You really haven't. I'm confused. I'm confused. You really haven't even defined what critical climate justice is. I can take a guess at what it is, but I haven't seen a definition for it anywhere. Funny, given that the name of the article is Critical Climate Justice. Anyway. Engaging with local communities is essential, with the explicit understanding that romancing the local is counterproductive and can obscure contextual intersectional oppressions. Considering intersectional gender, race, and class... Sorry about that. I was hearing the weather radio go off at the same time in the background. I apologize. Considering intersectional gender, race, and indigenous aspects of climate justice can help ensure interventions are equitable and contextually appropriate. You see what I mean? By here, what I mean from the contextually appropriate comment before? It means starting to include different perspectives, and that's okay. I'm not necessarily disagreeing with including different perspectives in these kinds of things. I don't necessarily agree with the social justice-y kind of approach and the activist kind of approach that's involved in this. But yes, I can understand that. Such concerns need to be worked through carefully and conscientiously, and this is where feminist insights are particularly prescient. Okay. So there was an awful lot of strange shit in there. Let's go to the next batch of strange shit. Feminist scholars have long demonstrated how climate justice will not be as effective or equitable without feminist perspectives and insights, since these integrate various feminist strands of scholarship as well as anti-racist, anti-colonial, and decolonial scholarship to advance justice-oriented praxis and futures. What the heck is praxis and futures in this? Feminist insights often inform critical climate justice scholarship without necessarily carrying a feminist label. This is because critical feminist analyses help to reveal oft overlooked or buried concern, exposing interconnected inequities and harms. Indeed, it was at the 2007 Conference of Parties where, quote, no climate justice without gender justice was a rallying cry from feminist climate activists and social movements. Women have been at the forefront of climate justice movements. They've raised awareness of the importance of paying attention to differential gendered burdens and harms worldwide. Increased intersectional gender marginalization, inequality, and vulnerability results from climate change. However, feminist analysis of climate justice is more than that. Feminism critiques capitalist patriarchy. Again, we have no love for capitalism, despite the fact that I don't know what capitalism actually gave us. Solar panels and windmills and the many different things that we have to improve the energy efficiency of our homes and, how many other different things. But I digress. It's given us so many things that are actually good for the environment and good for addressing climate change, and yet you still dislike capitalism. Anyway. Structural inequalities, and power relations of capitalist patriarchy occur across household, community, state, and international levels, whereby scalar analyses incorporating feminist insights reveal barriers and opportunities that can exist in configuring climate justice pathways. Okay. Feminist scholars examine the iterative and multiple knock-on effects of socio-ecological changes to gender relations in any given context. Vulnerable communities are not homogeneous. Instead, they are gendered intersectionally by class, race, okay. Such analyses necessitate investigating and addressing the contextual axes of oppression and differentiations. That's interesting that they make the difference there. Feminist climate justice scholarship engages with intersectionality to demonstrate how patriarchy compounds socio-ecological crises. It avoids essentializing women or men into binary categories, but looks at the specificities of interlocking systems of oppression and exploitation. By offering a more complex view of gender, the varied risks, responsibilities, and rights can be accounted for. Such analyses and praxis continue feminist traditions of inquiry into inequalities and injustices that promote critical reflexivity and engagement in analyses, which are vital for actualizing critical climate justice. Ye gods. Integrating feminist insights into critical climate justice also promotes inclusive planning beyond techno-managerialist climate solutions. It can strengthen women's strategic activism, advocacy, capacity building, and resource and network access. It also documents women's lived experiences and elevates differing voices, as well as how international political economy of development can derail gender justice and climate action. Spatial intersectionality across the global north and south and scalar intersectionality of race and indigeneity are essential aspects of feminist climate justice. Moving away from victim narratives or fetishizing resilience narratives to co-constructions and partnerships are necessary. In other words, they don't want people to be resilient and they don't want to be victims at the same time, and yet this whole thing has a whole heck of a lot of victim-related narratives that push people in that direction of oppression and marginalization and woe is me. Anyway, kind of things here going on. It's very, very confusing. Admittedly, it is very confusing and very strange and very not very grounded in science from what I can tell. Thus, anti-racist, anti-capitalist, feminist practice advances more complex understandings of climate injustices and consequent abilities of people to cope, adapt, and renew. Promoting care and commenting instead of endless growth and attention to feminist ethics of care and solidarity for structural inequities exacerbated by climate change have been advocated for. Scholars have also called for abolitionist climate justice that attempts to reframe climate harms to include broader institutional and infrastructural harms, environmental racism, and lived traumas. So if you thought, social justice might have been a good thing, but when it got turned into critical social justice, it went off the rails. And climate justice might have been a good idea at some point. It's gone off the rails as becoming critical climate justice. But wait, it gets stranger. Incorporating insights from feminist climate justice to bolster solidarity praxis enriches and reframes ongoing climate change discussions in multiple ways. Reframing includes reformulations of institutional arrangements to foster solidarity across differences and redistribution of power. Again, there it is. All about power. It is never about the truth. It is always about power. Don't forget it whenever you see it. It's always about power when you see these things. While discussions ensue on divestment and systemic dismantling of fossil fuel capitalism, attention is also needed on reparations and reciprocity. You heard that right. Guess what's coming next? Universalist logistics are confronted to underscore differential harms and vulnerabilities. An underlying theme in all this is the importance of solidarity praxis. That is, critical climate justice can only be achieved through working with others in collectives, both local and international. Which is to say, you can't have individualism because you can't get to the things that we want. That can only be done if we group you off into groups. You see the point here? Accountability and feedback loops and collaboration and co-learning facilitate transitions away from current structures that historically produce and contemporaneously reproduces climate injustices. You've never defined for me what justice is. You never defined for me what climate justice really is either. Anyway, such perspectives offer the possibility of transformations to occur instead of seeking to redress solely from within systems that are undergirded by patriarchy, racial capitalism, colonialism, extractivism, and exploitation. Congratulations, you've put in all the isms you can think of with that one. The colloquial saying, "the chickens have come home to roost," tragically points to the rising climate anxieties among elites in the global north. Yet this is also an opportunity and a need to cultivate solidarity, alliances, and collective action with historically marginalized communities whose grievances and losses were ignored and denied for a long time. Such alliances can support more equitable justice. You notice they always think of everybody in groups like this. There is never the individual. You are only the member of the group, and you are aggrieved by this thing because you're a member of this group. Well, what if I think differently? As much as this is put forward with the idea of wanting to help people, it's immensely dehumanizing. It is immensely dehumanizing here to see this, and that's why one of the many reasons why I can't stand this stuff is because it is really, in reality, incredibly dehumanizing to just be thinking of people as members of groups and only having collective action. Anyway, such alliances can support more equitable justice. Reframing with attention to intersectional feminist insights is also central to moving forward at other scales and sectors. For instance, climate finance or aid from advanced industrialized countries to historically exploited and impoverished post-colonial countries should not be considered charity or philanthropy, but rather as accountability and responsibility. Here we go. Check this out. Climate reparations are the acceptance of this responsibility of historical and contemporary harms and injustices, and the accountability through mechanisms such as finance for justice. This includes a range of issues such as mobility justice for refugees, finance for loss and damage for states, adaptation finance to communities, as well as reducing fossil fuel dependency, increasing decarbonization investments, and a range of measures to bring down carbon emissions rapidly without externalizing costs. These are constitutive components of climate reparations for colonial legacies of climate change. There you go. Something that is desired is climate reparations here. And, this is climate reparations. You're being so a fun way to say perhaps redistributing wealth, but in here, but there's no guarantee that this will actually end up being anything better for different communities that could make use of it or poorer countries. Because, if you do start giving money, just randomly ripping it away and giving it to money in different countries, and, if the government's corrupt, well, then it's not going to the people who need it, no matter how much you think well of it and think it should go there, and it's not going to matter. We ignore human nature and all these different things, and that's one that comes to mind with that right away. Such tactics generally eschew market capitalism, especially green capitalism, tied to climate colonialism, results in land grabbing, sacrifice zones, biofuels, and mining dispossessions, water contamination, and so forth. These can further compound and generate new intersectional sufferings and harms. For instance, water contamination from oil spills or extractive economies, as well as climate-induced drought, can exacerbate household water insecurities that increase domestic water provisioning burdens on women and girls in many places. This impacts individual, household, and societal well-being, progress over time. Even solutions like the Green New Deal can reproduce climate colonialism and exacerbate gender burdens if not undertaken ethically and carefully. A feminist climate justice approach fosters integration of different conceptual and tactical aspects to intentionally and inclusively address climate reparations. Right there. They don't like this guy doesn't like the Green New Deal. Because it won't work well enough if it ends up reproducing colonialism, right? If it ends up whatever the hell climate colonialism is too. Good grief. Relatedly, existing global governance structures can also benefit from insights of feminist climate justice. It has been posited that current frameworks and structures are complicit in maintaining neocolonialism and reproducing discourses and material realities that produce hierarchical relationships and barriers. Current modalities and institutional arrangements have been critiqued for being inadequate in addressing critical climate justice concerns, internationally and intersectionally. Existing scholarship has documented critiques of community governance, participation, capitalist growth as the solution, and apolitical resilience discourses that are replete in climate policies. Funny thing is, for all of their claims that capitalism is the evil here, what is it? Which governing system has driven more people into poverty and resulted in inequality and a huge amount of vulnerabilities for a huge number of people across the world? Which one is it? Oh yeah, it's the dictatorships associated with fascism, and you have communism and socialism that do a lot of these things and cause a lot of more harm and inequities than anything else. And of course, you've got North Korea, which vast majority of its population lives in poverty. Why? Because of the fascist government. So I don't know. Maybe yeah, I wonder about capitalism being worse than others, when it seems to actually give us the tools to be able to help communities that are really vulnerable to these things and perhaps help those communities rise above poverty or to develop into strong communities or something like that. And fascism and communism and socialism really don't. Just a thought. These approaches are often gender insensitive or lacking in reckoning with investigating and addressing more complex findings that emerge from intersectional analysis. Undertaking an intersectional feminist climate justice approach. God, what a combination of words. Intersectional feminist climate justice approach would help with improved planning, project design, networking, advocacy, and public discourse. Concrete differences need to be recognized and tackled systemically, or else restorative measures will ultimately fail, collapsing under the weight of their own inequality. In other words, if we don't do them how we think they should be done, they'll collapse because they're unequal anyway. Well, as much as it sucks, I'm sorry, you're not going to get equality of outcomes everywhere. It doesn't happen. As much as it sucks, and as much as, yes, you should help the poor, you should help the most vulnerable, we should be doing that. Absolutely. That I'm not disagreeing. But, trying to presume there's going to be equality of outcome amongst all different peoples is quite a utopic thinking, and utopic thinking has caused horrible problems in history. So, no, I don't think that's necessarily a good idea. Reframing climate debates with insights from various feminist insights and solidarity practice helps us to unearth and redress root causes instead of seeking out quick techno-managerialist solutions. It confronts patriarchy in communities, institutions, and policymaking, and thereby recognizes the importance of intersectional gender analysis, disaggregated data collection, ethical research designs, collaborative planning, and critical reflexivity. Such endeavors focus on regenerative economies, what the heck is that, and systemic solutions that account for and financially support care, calming, repair, and reparation. This raises awareness on interconnections across places and issues, not isolated domestic solutions, but accounts for international externalities and impacts. Relatedly, it recognizes that global racial justice is integral to intersectional feminist climate justice, ultimately decentering historically powerful voices towards recentering of marginalized voices and lived wisdoms? What the hell is lived wisdoms? And is this another, I dislike, you all know if you've watched this channel, I dislike the phrase lived experiences very much because by definition an experience is something that you've lived, so that's stupid phrasing is what it is. Anyway, so why lived wisdoms? What the hell's lived wisdoms? Of communities are valued, good grief. Self-determination and collectives building are promoted. All right, we made it to the conclusion section. Look at that. Critical climate justice is ultimately about obligations and ethical relations with people and ecosystems. Climate change is a moral problem and a justice concern, not only on an economic or scientific one. It is not only about finances or technology, but a shift in mindsets and framing of issues. Critical climate justice is as much about development, democracy, and citizenship as about international politics, financing, geographies, and histories. Somehow, I don't think this is about democracy as much as they say it is. As much as the author claims it to be. I really kind of doubt that, to be honest. Just a gut intuition on that one. It's more so than anything, because usually when it comes to these things, for as much as they've gone after capitalism here, capitalism ends up working better with democracies and constitutional republics, which is what the U.S. is. Anyway, attention to feminist insights for critical climate justice encourages policymakers and citizens to approach climate change in more comprehensive ways. It calls for accountability to intersectional feminist analysis so that lived experiences and wisdom of differentially situated subjects. Why don't you just say people? Are heard and heeded, and appropriate and inclusive policies and programs are planned. Don't forget, actually, the root of the word inclusive is the Latin includere, actually, and the exact translation of includere is actually to imprison or to confine, by the way, so don't forget that. Paying attention to various power relations in any context is central to fine-tuning and addressing the inequalities, marginalizations, and vulnerabilities reinforced through disruptive climate patterns and socio-ecological changes across scales and sites. Again, it's always about power with these people. It is never about the truth. Advancing critical climate justice by making it more meaningful and inclusive thus becomes about recognizing and reducing intersectional harms that occur both within and across communities and reframing debates. Climate justice research and action necessitate deploying intersectional approaches for comprehensive accountability of various systemic injustices that overlap and compound. Decision makers paying attention to gender, race, class, and other axes of difference can the axes of difference. Wait a second. Gender, race, class are axes of difference between people. That is a new kind of crazy phrasing for this. Because of course you're talking about usually they're talking about it in terms of identities. You know, these are different identities that you have. So now they're not identities, they're just axes of difference. I don't know what I think of that, to be honest. Really don't know what I think of that. Addressing issues of colonial harm and racial harm, can thus avoid reductionist solutions and pursue more equitable ones without cookie-cutter approaches or one-size-fits-all. Addressing issues of colonial harm and racial harm remains central to critical climate justice solidarity praxis. This necessitates learning from a broad range of anti-oppression scholarship, such as anti-colonial, decolonial, feminist, anti-racist, and indigenous scholarship and action, which the vast majority of these are related to critical social justice, which they appear prominently in Cynical Theories. If you read Cynical Theories by James Lindsay and Helen Parkrose, you probably know what these are. And I very highly recommend that book. Critical climate justice praxis thereby encourages accounting for research, ethics, knowledge, co-production, and solidarity building, all of which continue to be enriched by critical feminist scholarship and praxis. There are no easy or quick fixes to pursuing critical climate justice. There is imperative to reimagine, to configure pathways forward. Different changes and challenges will need various forms of action and policies, not one universalist truth or solution. Systems change needed for critical climate justice entails confronting capitalist extractivism and climate colonialism, whereby collaboration becomes vital. Given contemporary events and concerns, it is important to revolutionize how people think about climate change towards a more critical climate justice praxis of solidarities and collective actions that can draw from feminist and other critical bodies of scholarship and activism. Ultimately, there is no singular or ideal climate justice for all, no singular arrival point, but a becoming of doing more and better, unlearning to relearn, and continually taking stock in various collectivities for equitable and transformative praxis. Holy crap. Okay. Finally done that article. That is a short article, but there's so much word salad in there. My gosh. What a word salad mess this is. Okay. For one thing, I have no idea. They give me no definition, actually, no simple, straightforward definition of what critical climate justice is. In 5 pages of reading. 5 pages of reading that, no definition of what critical climate justice actually is in here. Though I can take a big guess, and it has to do with a lot of postmodernist thought in here that would fall in line with some of the commentary of James Lindsay with regard to cynical theories. But in this case, what it takes into account is, okay, you poor marginalized person, you also have to deal with the oppression of climate change that other people have apparently caused because it was primarily industrialized northern countries that have driven climate change to be what it is, never mind that the actual total number of carbon that comes into the atmosphere that would be affecting that actually comes from China. Totally other question there, but just pointing out the data, and then that's a fun thing in World of Data. You can, if you go look at this in World in Data, you can actually see this with the carbon dioxide emissions per capita. Yes, the U.S. does emit the most carbon, but in terms of total, that comes from China. You can look at it 2 different ways, and you can see that for yourself. Not making it up, just stating something from data there that I know exists. So. This is interesting. This is word salad is what this is. This is not scholarship. This is not a study. This is a commentary to begin with. This is not even a study masquerading as a study, but it is a commentary. And this is involving how do you do activism. The fact that this was published in a peer-reviewed journal of the Royal Geographical Society is a concerning factor in all together with it. And a huge amount of word salad here. Again, I've done my best to break this down for you and to read it off. There's a tremendous amount of word salad. There's a whole bunch of things in there that I did not expect to see. And dear goodness Goodness, goodness, goodness. What craziness can we come up with at this point? Um, Always, always, always ask for definitions for different things. If somebody's giving it to you, whether they're talking about what have you, ask them to very clearly and specifically define things. And if they don't give you that, keep pushing. And if they still refuse to give you that, well, then you're not dealing with someone who's necessarily interested in helping you understand something as much as they are perhaps interested in ramming it down your throat. So this is one hell of a study. No, not really a study or a study. It's a commentary. But I would not be surprised if I saw more of this stuff come up in activism circles somewhere in the near future, particularly with the potential pivots to dealing more with climate change, both in the US and abroad. So I think this is a good article to keep in the back pocket for what kind of language you might actually see come up very soon in the future with the increasing interest in climate change related stuff going on. So that's it for now. There's one heck of an article. I hope you enjoyed it. I think it's a bit of postmodernist garbage, per usual. I'm not a big fan of postmodernism, and this has got a lot of it in there myself, rather than Enlightenment principles. But anyway, that's it for now. If you like this, hit the like button on the way out the door. Subscribe to the channel. Share the video, comment on the video, all that good jazz. Don't forget, in about at 8 o'clock Central Time, if you are a local supporter, you can join us for an exclusive live chat for more on this topic in particular, and any other questions you might be interested in having me answer. And that would be it for now. So come on over to Locals. If you're a supporter in Locals, you have access to that live chat after this show, after this premieres on YouTube. And that's it for now. Until next time, I am Adrian. I hope you all stay curious, my friends.